Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining me tonight. I think the first tutorial offered by the Socratic Circle. We'll see what comes of it. Um, the philosopher chosen from among the three I think that I had offered, even though there were only a couple of votes, was I think the right one, the one I was expecting to be chosen, and that's Friedrich Nietzsche. Um, Nietzsche is one of those names that um, is fairly well known, I think, as much as philosophers' names are well known outside of philosophy. Nietzsche's is one of those names I think that is known to many. Um, it is also, however, the case that Nietzsche is probably the most misinterpreted and misappropriated of the philosophers, certainly in the Western philosophical tradition. I'll say a little bit about that as well. Um, all right. So let's see. So I have some bullet points, some of the major concepts associated with Nietzsche's name, such as the concept of nihilism, the phrase "God is dead," the will to power, eternal recurrence, right, and other such phrases and terms. And so, what I intend to do in the short time that we have together to go over these key ideas is to sort of hit those beats, give you an idea of the context, what they're really about. While also pointing out that one reason why I think Nietzsche is the most misinterpreted is also because he's not easy to interpret. Nietzsche was very different from most of the rest of the writers in the Western tradition. Most of those that make up the Western canon, the writings we have of theirs were you got Plato in the dialogues, but even there is pretty clear what the philosophical questions are and what the views are that are being wrestled over, and even the arguments that are being put forward and critiqued. And then, of course, in the case of many others, the Descartes and the Kants and the Humes and the Spinozas and so on and so forth, they're writing philosophical treatises, and they're very much writing to be understood as best as they can manage to make their difficult and unusual ideas clear. Nietzsche wasn't really writing to be understood. In fact, uh, his he took pride in expecting really only to be understood by the few, the ones that in some sense were the ones that for whom it was proper to really understand the radical ideas that he was offering. So a lot of Nietzsche's writings is consists of aphorisms and just pithy little turns of phrase and so on and so forth. You have to do a lot of work to try to make sense of the larger picture that emerges out of all of it. So the fact that, or at least as I'm suggesting, that it's a fact that Nietzsche is the most misinterpreted is in part due to the very style in which Nietzsche wrote. He was trained as a philologist, especially of classical literature, the Greek tragedies and so forth, which he greatly admired. Um, and really sort of came to philosophy a little bit later in his later sort of educational career when he encountered the work of Arthur Schopenhauer, another German philosopher of about a generation or two prior to Nietzsche's. Nietzsche was born in 1844. Schopenhauer, I think, was 1788, I want to say. Okay, so yeah, Nietzsche's real sort of academic background and training was sort of in classical literature. But he encountered the philosophy of Schopenhauer and certainly went on to read, Kant and a lot of the other and Plato and especially and um, and so for the most part now he's really Nietzsche, of course, is revered as a philosopher, even if a somewhat non-standard one. Okay, all right. So much for all of that. A lot of that sort of biographical stuff, of course, you can certainly look up yourself. You can find pretty reliable stuff on these days on even Wikipedia. All right, so let's get into some what's going on here with Nietzsche. Oh, well, I did want to say this, right? And here's the other reason that Nietzsche is often misinterpreted or even misappropriated, right? So two big ones, one small, one really big. The small one is this: is Nietzsche in those pithy phrases and so on and so forth. Really strikes often a kind of countercultural stand, right? There's this notion of creating your own, well, even before that this idea that there are no values inherent to life, and that it's up to each person to kind of make their own way forward and will to power. Don't let things hold you back, right? And just strive to accomplish whatever it is you're setting out to accomplish, and so on and so forth. As you might imagine, for a certain demographic, teenagers in the later teenage years, and those often in their 20s. I was there once upon a time myself, so no offense intended. This kind of message can often sound liberating, right? It can be liberating. Oh, I'm just gonna strike out. I don't have to worry about what society is telling me to do. I'm gonna do my own thing. And that's not quite exactly what Nietzsche was saying, right? Or sometimes Nietzsche is taken to be saying that there really is no truth of any kind. You can just make up your own. This is a real strong interpretation of Nietzsche's playing with the notion of perspectivism, the idea that there's multiple perspectives by which anything, in a sense, can be examined. A strong interpretation of that takes us all the way to the claim that there's really just no objective truth of any kind, right? Nothing's objectively true. To the extent that there's anything worth calling truth, it's ultimately subjective. There's debate even amongst professional philosophers about the extent to which Nietzsche really intends his treatment of truth to be thoroughly subjectivist. One quick reason for thinking that Nietzsche did not intend for his take on truth to be thoroughly subjectivist is that he often puts forward his view of things as though they are objectively true. But I'll comment on that a little bit later. Okay, so let's begin then. Nietzsche was very much a prodigy. He landed a position as a lecturer, professor at the age of 24, which was certainly would be quite young today and was quite young then, at the University of Basel, again as a philologist. And his first published work in English is called The Birth of Tragedy, in which he was examining sort of Greek tragedy as literature. And even in that work, he was already kind of wrestling with an examination of values. Okay. Now that work itself was not well received by the academic community at the time. And to Nietzsche's dismay, certainly, but in many ways, I think it's fair to say that was that was a foreboding, right, of the fact that the messages that Nietzsche found himself trying to articulate in his works were never going to be found to be popular. In The Birth of Tragedy, and then we'll sort of springboard past this quickly, a philosophical question that really emerges, a real value question that emerges is life worth living? Is life worth living? Now, I mentioned earlier about Nietzsche coming under the influence of the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. So let me quickly say something about Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is well known for what is often called a philosophy of pessimism, right? So Arthur Schopenhauer was one of the first maybe the first in the Western philosophical tradition to really encounter Eastern philosophy. Schopenhauer read the Upanishads, was impressed by them, greatly influenced by them, read the Bhagavad Gita, and studied Buddhism as well, thought it was the most perfect of religions. Schopenhauer very much found Indian philosophy, or at least what he came to know of it, to be quite profound, right? And so Schopenhauer's take on this, especially from the point of view of what he knew of Buddhism, right, was this idea that life is suffering, right? Life is replete with suffering. Even when a desire of ours is satisfied, that satisfaction is short-lived. That desire is soon replaced by another, right? And then there you are, just striving again and striving again in this way that never is ever fully satisfied, perhaps except upon death, right? That life is replete with suffering. Um, Now, for all that, Schopenhauer, well, in some ways, brought some suffering upon himself. Well, in his own mind anyway, he was a rival, Schopenhauer, of another famous philosopher of the time, George Hegel. And uh, in those days, um, professors, right, would give their lecture, they would decide when to offer their lectures, and then students would, right, choose to come attend your lectures or not. That choice was often a very direct choice. It wasn't, oh, well, the registrar told me I have to take this class. It was, we're going to go listen to, right? If there's room, we can get in. We're going to go listen, to Hegel talk today, kind of thing. And in Schopenhauer's own mind, he imagined this rivalry with Hegel. So he scheduled his own, he was jealous of Hegel. And so he scheduled his own lectures at exactly the same time that Hegel was delivering his. And that did not go well. So Hegel's room continued to overflow. Not many people showed up to Schopenhauer's lectures. And so, some of the suffering that Schopenhauer experienced, he brought upon himself. But aside from that, so, Schopenhauer, for the most part, was an atheist. And so didn't have certainly no Christian notion or Judeo-Christian Islamic notion of, well, there will be this next life that'll be better or anything like that. So, you might think, wow, given this philosophy of pessimism, Schopenhauer must have been really miserable. And I guess in some ways, yes, but he also was a bit of a bon vivant, right? I mean, he enjoyed himself. He went to the prominent theaters and for performances, musical performances, and live performances of various sorts. And so he seemed to enjoy himself. Now, that is in part consistent, it might not seem at first, but in part consistent with his philosophy, right? Schopenhauer looked upon the arts as offering a temporary, right? A temporary distraction from the suffering of which life is largely constituted, right? Okay, so Nietzsche's philosophical development in some ways begins here, right? He picks up certainly this kind of atheism. We'll talk more about that as we go. But he picks up this idea that life is suffering, right? And so he's playing with this idea a bit in The Birth of Tragedy. And when he asks the question, is life worth living? The answer he gives is no. On the whole, it's not worth living. But, right, in a tragic culture, or what Nietzsche meant by a tragic culture was one that through its art, right, through its literature and its music and so forth, really can kind of embrace the suffering of life and make art out of it. That in a tragic culture, that culture offers, right, art of a powerful sort, such that we can tolerate the knowledge that life on the whole is otherwise not worth living. Okay, so Nietzsche begins in a very Schopenhauerian place, okay? But he does not stop there. And this was early in his career, and he does eventually move beyond this, okay? And so that's where we'll begin to go. Now, the other thing I did want to mention about the misappropriation of Nietzsche, and this is something that many of you might already know, right? Though you might not know the details, right? So Nietzsche basically collapsed into madness at the age of about 46. So this was about 1890 or so. I want to say it was like early 1890, or did it go into 1891? 1890, 1891. And he never recovered. But he did go on to live for another 10 years, largely in a catatonic state. First taken care of by his mother. And then after she died in 1893, his sister, Elizabeth, took custody of Nietzsche. And at that point became the executrix of his literary estate. And it was right about that time that she came into this position, that his works were beginning to gain traction with the public at large. He had published and he had some, enough success. But as is more often the case than not, it's not until after an author or an artist, right, has died, or for another reason, or one reason or another, kind of disappeared, that sometimes they, then their work really begins getting noticed, right, by the public at large. And so that was beginning to happen. Now, Elizabeth was married to a fellow by the name of Bernard Forster. Forster, as well as Elizabeth. Forster himself was a German nationalist and an anti-Semite. Okay. And Elizabeth very much shared those outlooks. Nietzsche himself, all the evidence that we have and things that he published in his lifetime indicate that that was certainly not the case. He very much valued Jewish culture. He was impressed by it. And in many places, he rebuffed and even harshly criticized anti-Semitism. Okay. However, in some of his unwritten works, where little aphorisms here and there, stuff like that, stuff that he never had set forth for publication, passages here and there that, if you put them together in certain ways, may have been suggestive of of somewhat anti-Semitic views, of sort of German nationalistic views. But there's just no evidence that in Nietzsche's seen lifetime that in fact, he spoke out against those things. He was very much critical of politicians and anyone who would aspire to be a politician. He thought, politics were aimed at all the wrong things, and more often than not got in the way of things. However, Elizabeth cobbled together a posthumous publication called The Will to Power. Now, there is some debate among scholars about the extent to which she promoted Nietzsche's works to the Nazis, right, and emphasized the kind of anti-Semitism and nationalism, or to what extent those who were already sympathetic to German nationalism and the Nazi movement, anti-Semitism, found the works, right, expressed interest in them, and then she kind of went along for the ride. When she died in 1835, Hitler attended her funeral. So there's been some debate about to what extent Elizabeth deserves vilification. Okay. So I myself don't have a firm stance on that. But that the Nazis used, especially the writings as curated by Elizabeth, to claim some degree of authority, right, for their views, by basing the name of this individual, this German author who now was, being more widely revered. Okay, that is very much the case. In fact, the association between Nietzsche and the Nazis had become so great that even up until after World War II, into the 1950s, Nietzsche just was not touched by professional philosophers in the United States, in England, and in most of Europe as well. It wasn't really until the 1950s that a Princeton philosopher by the name of Walter Kaufmann published a book called Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist, in which, while not agreeing with all of Nietzsche's philosophy, nevertheless, he did a lot of the scholarly work to dissociate Nietzsche himself from the misappropriation made of Nietzsche's work by his sister and certainly the Nazis. And that started the rehabilitation of Nietzsche's reputation in the second half of the 20th century, to the point where now today, the Nietzsche Society and work, and works on experts, people spending their careers becoming experts in Nietzsche's philosophy, it's flourishing once again, in a way that I think is wonderful and fantastic. In fact, what I'll do after the tutorial's over, I'll make a follow-up post on our Patreon, indicating like a bibliography of things that's, works that someone might want to read if they want to follow up, with a further study of Nietzsche. All right, so much for kind of that sort of background stuff. So let's move forward then, right? So God is dead, right? Nietzsche is fairly well known for having exclaimed the death of God. Now, certainly, right, it's not the case that by exclaiming that God is dead, that Nietzsche was intending to act like a news reporter, all right, as though Nietzsche's, recognized that we all agree that there was this, fellow named God who, was kind of hanging out with us, walking around, and then one day, lo and behold, there he is, he's on the ground. And it's like, oh, is he dead? He's dead. And now he's reporting the news, right? There was this guy, this guy God, he walked amongst us and then he keeled over and now he's dead. Hey, everyone, God's dead. Right? No. Obviously, that's not what Nietzsche intended or what Nietzsche meant when Nietzsche wrote that God is dead. What he meant is this. Okay, what he meant is this. He was looking around, okay, mid to late 19th century Europe. Right, so he was born in Germany. He spent time in Switzerland and in France and in Italy, right? Okay, and so he looks around late 19th century Europe. Okay, and what he sees is certainly among the aristocracy, the upper class, the educated classes, so to speak, that that belief in the existence of God was beginning to fall away. Yeah, sure. Amongst the everyday, amongst the masses, right? Okay, there's still plenty of religious belief and right, religious affiliation. But here we are. We're talking a century and a half, couple centuries now. The Enlightenment has been doing its thing, and among the educated classes, not only was it now less risky for writers to come out and more or less say, hey, I'm an atheist. I don't believe God exists. But it was becoming a bit more fashionable. It was certainly more widely acceptable, right? Especially among the educated classes. And so Nietzsche looks around, and even for those that were still mouthing, right, religious beliefs and religious affiliation, right? You look and see the way that they were living their lives. They don't really believe. It's just a mantra, right, that they're mouthing because maybe they're by habit or they think they have to, or it provides them with some kind of solace, but they don't really believe, right? Okay, so this would in a sense what Nietzsche was doing was he was making a comment upon European culture at the time that belief in God was falling away. Now, it wasn't just the fact that, there were, let's say, philosophers coming out of the Enlightenment who were willing to make this claim. It's also because of the development of modern science, right? So you have advances in physics, our understanding of astronomy, and then physics, chemistry, right? And then advances in biology as well, where we were coming to understand so much more about how the natural world worked. Whereas once upon a time, it was very mysterious to us, and the easiest way to at least soothe our anxieties over not really understanding what was going on was that, oh, God did it, right? It's the good old God of the gaps explanation. Oh, God does all that. We can't figure out any other way it could possibly happen. So there must be a God, an intelligence who does all this sort of stuff, who's responsible for all of this. But as more and more advances were being made, allowing us to understand the world around us in more naturalistic terms. Again, right? Atheism, in a sense, was becoming more comfortable, more sort of rationally acceptable. The contemporary evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, I forgot exactly where he wrote this, and or said this, but he claimed that it was really the work of Darwin, right? Origin of Species, being published in 1859. It was really the work of Darwin that allowed a person to be a rationally satisfied atheist, right? Because prior to that, you were still, even if your naturalism went very, very far, you were still left with this gap, right? It's like, but there's this, look at this order to things, right? Look at the various forms of life and the way they seem to be so well adapted to their environments. And boy, it sure seems like there needs to be, right, the watchmaker, there needs to, right, be the intelligence who's overseeing all this. And and has constructed to be just the way it is. And in the absence of any alternative naturalistic account, right, it's hard to be rationally satisfied with a thoroughgoing naturalism. Okay, so there are many factors at play here. But so what Nietzsche has in mind when he says that God is dead is really a comment. He's looking around and making a kind of, sociological comment. He's saying that belief in God is falling away. Now, okay, what is following from this? What's so important about this? Well, what Nietzsche sees happening is that the falling away of the belief in God is giving rise to a pandemic, if you will, of nihilism, right? Nihilism is the view that says basically nothing is of value. There are no values. There's nothing to be valued, right? Nothing matters. Nothing is worth anything, right? Think about annihilation. To annihilate something, right, is to render it into nothingness, right? So nihilism is the view then that nothing has meaning, right? Nothing is meaningful at all. There is nothing, there are no values, right? All value drains away. Okay, so why was this happening? What's this connection between loss of belief in God, loss of belief in the sort of Judeo-Christian, Christian Islamic God, and the rise of nihilism? Well, as you might imagine, and certainly as Nietzsche saw it, right, is that the values that people had embraced, had at least putatively been living by, were the ones derived, right, from the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. Now, Nietzsche largely focuses on Christianity, and so I'll just for shorthand, we'll talk about Christian values, right? Okay, and so the value system that had been underwriting or serving as the foundation for European life, right, had been the Christian morality, the Christian value system, and that was dependent upon belief in Christianity, belief in the Christian God. And with the loss of belief in the Christian God, then the foundations of that value system seem to be, right, seem to just themselves dissipate. And the whole value system now was left without foundations. Okay. And thus, so Nietzsche diagnoses it, right? We have this rise of nihilism. Nothing means anything. Nothing's worth anything. Life isn't worth living, right? This goes hand in hand with the idea of suffering, and there's nothing to redeem it. There's right all the no God to make sure that in the next life, right, things are better or something like that, and so forth. Now there are many who think that Nietzsche stops there. They identify Nietzsche with nihilism. Okay, that's a very superficial reading. There really aren't any professional philosophers who stop there. Okay, but this is one of the ways in which certainly outside of professional philosophy or any kind of philosophical training, those that just kind of casually come across some Nietzsche, this is one of the common misinterpretations that Nietzsche's a nihilist, right? And there's just nothing of value, and nothing has meaning in and of itself or anything like that. Nietzsche does not stop there, and this is Nietzsche moving beyond the early Nietzsche of the birth of tragedy. Okay. Nietzsche sees this not as cause ultimately for despair. In fact, Nietzsche thinks that this is very much to be welcomed, because the value system, right, the Christian morality, the Christian value system, okay, Nietzsche despised. He saw it as life negating, right? The Christian value system, as Nietzsche, right, experienced it, as Nietzsche, right, viewed it, was one that was about sacrificing this life and what could be good in this life, all for a life to come, right? That the Christian values were ones of self-restraint, self-denial, self-abnegation. At the extreme of that, you can think of the strand of Christianity that very much made a virtue out of suffering, right? The extent to which you suffer is the extent to which you provide yourself with an opportunity to grow spiritually. And in a sense, this extent to which you suffer is kind of an indication of the depth, right, of your spirituality. Okay. Right. So think about, for example, the ascetic tradition in Christianity, right? Uh, Monks sleeping on stone slabs and eating as little food as possible, just enough to keep them going so that they can engage in their studies the next day, and so on and so forth. But Nietzsche doesn't even have those extremes necessarily in mind. He's even just talking about the Christian values as they were promulgated for the everyday person, right? So these demands of charity, these demands of sacrificing opportunities of your own for advancing yourself and advancing your interests to ensure that others who otherwise would be falling behind, right, are taken care of, right? Sort of an analogy that I use in my classes, analogy, metaphor. Think about it like this. Imagine life as a marathon, right? We all line up. We're going to run a marathon, okay? And some people, some people are right there at the starting line. Others are a few rows back, and everyone starts in exactly the same place. But anyway, right? The gun is fired, the starting gun, and we take off. Some of us, right? We're way out in front, setting a record pace. Others of us kind of are doing all right, and then of course others are really falling behind. Okay. Now imagine there you are. Maybe you're not exactly setting the record pace, but you're right behind. And then you hear from behind, someone falls to the pavement. You look back, right? And there's one of fellow human beings. They twisted their ankle and they're down. They're down. Right? The Christian morality says, well, stop running, go back and help them up. Now, what are the odds that you're going to win this marathon? What are the odds that you're going to even set your own personal best if you stop and go back and help that person up? Not very good, right? You're not nearly going to finish as well as you could have if you just said, well, sorry, dude, I'm going. Right? So the extent to which the Christian morality, right, requires us to, in some ways, limit ourselves, right, to be our brothers and sisters keepers. Okay. To think in terms of charity, to think in terms of humility, right, and so on and so forth. Nietzsche found this greatly problematic. He described this as being life disaffirming, right, life negating. Okay, so Nietzsche does not leave us with nihilism. Instead, what he calls for is a revaluation of values. Right? Nietzsche says, no, what we need is a new value system. This is an opportunity. Right? The value system that had been holding us back, what in some places is referred to as something like a slave morality, okay, is falling away. Now's the opportunity. Now we can seize the opportunity. And this is where the idea of the Ubermensch, the Overman, the Superman, call it what you will. Well, I'll go with Overman for the moment. Okay, comes in because the Overman is the person who propounds new values, life-affirming values. This is an opportunity. Now, I do want to add in a little bit more detail about the idea of the notion of slave morality. One of Nietzsche's early philosophical books, Beyond Good and Evil, okay, is particularly important on this point, right? So again, given Nietzsche's knowledge and expertise in ancient Greek literature and philosophy, he very much admired, right, ancient Greek, especially in the era of the great tragedians, because they were a culture of what he called good and bad, rather than a culture of good and evil. What's the difference? Okay, well, good and bad is about excellence. Is somebody good at something or bad at something? To what extent, or somewhere along that spectrum, right? Bad, not in the sense of bad as evil, but bad in the sense of not as skillful, not as excellent. Nietzsche responds to excellence. His is a philosophy, a value system of excellence, right? So this idea of the ancient, that the value system of the ancient Greeks, especially in the time period of let's say the I guess maybe even going into the 7th century, certainly the 6th century, 5th century, perhaps into the 4th century, BC, before the common era. Okay. And the Greeks valued excellence, whether it was excellence in combat, excellence in oratory, right? Excellence in sculpting, whatever it might be, but it was excellence. And the idea of competing to see who could be the most excellent. I mean, think about the Greeks establishing the Olympic Games, right? Excellence, the good, right? And then separating it from the mediocre and the bad. Whereas with the advent of Christianity, right, what Nietzsche's interpretation of this is that what happened is the 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 hoi polloi, those who were kind of the commoners, those who were more or less, doing the drudge work of the slaves and so on and so forth. Okay. Those who, by the measures of good and bad, were not exactly exemplars of excellence, somehow pulled off an amazing revolt and turned the tables, right? By replacing a value system rooted in good and bad with one rooted in good and evil. So that, in a sense, those who otherwise were excellent and in expressing their excellence were kind of, putting further distance between themselves and the everyday individuals. Okay, we're being called back. Hey, 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 not so nice. Right? That's evil of you to be this way, to allow us to be treated like this. This is evil. Right? To do this is wrong. God will condemn you. Right? The meek shall inherit the earth. These kinds of ideas. Right? And so, in a sense, right, the slave morality is one that is life negating. It is one that impedes the pursuit of excellence, as Nietzsche sees it. Okay. Now, another key point to be careful about with regard to Nietzsche is, now, okay, partly a matter of interpretation, but in many ways, the more modern or contemporary interpretation is going in this direction, and I'm very sympathetic to this interpretation. Nietzsche was not dismissive. He did not think cruelty toward those who knew nothing of excellence was called for. He recognized that the revaluation of values, the values of the overman, if you will, were not necessarily going to be embraced by all people, nor did he think that embracing them would necessarily get everyone particularly far. He didn't say that those that were embracing these new values should be mean or cruel or destroy, right, those who were not of the overman class, so to speak. Nietzsche, by all reports, was very kind, very considerate, right? I mean, he was very much an introvert. He wasn't, living up at parties, stuff like that. But by all accounts that we have, because he was often traveling about, he would stay at one tavern or inn for a few weeks here or months here for a season, and then move to this one and that one. That he was quite amiable and pleasant. No one had a bad word to say about him. Okay. But what he is concerned about, right, is that the value system at large be one that allows for the affirmation of life and allows for the pursuit of excellence. Again, right, it's that marathon metaphor. The value system should allow, especially for those who have the potential in themselves to set those records, to run. Go, run, don't look back, don't worry. Now, an interesting question that arises here is, what if this were a value system that everyone tried to live up to? Right? What might result from that, right? Would that be a good thing? Again, Nietzsche did not write to be understood by everybody. I'll say it now, and we can come back to it. In some ways, maybe for the purpose of presentation, maybe I'd be better off holding this back a little bit. But I'm there now. It's in my head. I'll share the story with you. So there's a novel by the early 20th century author W. Somerset Maugham. It's called The Moon and Sixpence, and it was published in 1919. And in this novel, the main character is named Charles Strickland. And the course of events in the novel, and this character Strickland in particular, it's loosely inspired by the life of a real historical person, the artist Paul Gauguin. Okay. And so the story of Paul Gauguin is one in which this real life artist, it kind of had an ordinary life up to about maybe, I don't know, about 40 years old or so, had a family and an ordinary job and all this sort of stuff. And then just got in his head one day that he just wanted to be a painter, and that, to truly pursue painting, he just couldn't continue living the life that he had been living. Those responsibilities were just going to get in the way, right? Okay, so W. Somerset Maugham picks up on this idea and he creates a kind of a novelization of this. And so we have the character Charles Strickland, okay, who when first introduced in the novel is like a successful stockbroker. He has a wife and he's got children and he's got a well-established like manor house and with servants. So he's by traditional lights in the traditional value system, he's done well for himself. He's been a morally good person, and in a sense, right, living in that within that value system, he's been rewarded. Things are going well, but of course, within that value system, he has certain responsibilities as a father, as a husband, right, as a professional, and so on and so forth, right, as the overseer of this manor, and so on and so forth. Okay, but very early in the novel. And the novel's told from the point of view of this narrator who's very interested. He's come to learn about the story of Strickland, and he's very interested to find out whatever became of Strickland. Because what happens is Strickland, at about the age of 40, right, leaves behind a Dear John, Dear Jane letter, right? So he leaves behind a letter to his wife saying, my love, I'm sorry, it's been real, but I gotta paint. It's in me. I gotta be a painter. And, just hanging out with you and the kids, I can't really do that. I'm out of here. Okay. And he leaves. Now, from the point of view of the traditional moral, value system or traditional morality, heck, even the standard morality that we still embrace today, right? That's a bit problematic. Right? Wow, what a terrible husband, what a terrible father, right? What a terrible professional. That's terrible. This is how selfish, right? How unethical. But the narrator, and in some way, and certainly Nietzsche as well, is not quick to evaluate things in that fashion, right? So to stick with the story, right, the narrator comes to learn, and this is a few years, this is a couple decades later, that after leaving his family, Strickland went to Tahiti. Okay, and so the narrator is like on the trail. He's trying to track down Strickland, find out what became of him. So he finally, as the novel unfolds, I don't mean to spoil this, but I guess I'll be spoiling it a little bit for you, right? As the novel unfolds, right, he's hot on the trail. And he gets to the island, and now he's there. He's asking around, and finally, someone is able to answer him. He says, "Oh, yeah, yeah, this, and the painter guy, all this sort of stuff." And the narrator is disappointed to find out that Strickland has recently died, but he is told that Strickland's art is on display somewhere, not far away. And so the narrator, of course, asks, he says, "Please, can you take me? Take me. I want to see it." Right? Okay. And so, now we get to the big moment, right? The narrator is about to turn the corner, enter into the room where he will behold, right, the artwork produced by Charles Strickland, right? Now, think about that moment before turning the corner, right? Think about it. If we turn that corner and what we see up on those walls is like stick figures, finger painting, right? Like the kind of stuff the pre-K kids put up on the refrigerator, right? Like, I don't know about you, but in that moment, I'm thinking, oh man, Strickland, what a bastard. Dude, you left your family, you abandoned them for this? It's terrible. Terrible. What'd you do? But maybe, right? If we turn that corner and our breath catches as we find ourselves beholding, right, these beautiful works of art, instead we might go, I get it. Yeah, okay. Okay. Yeah, I feel bad still for the kids and your wife and all that. I feel bad, but yes, look what you have bequested to humanity. Yeah, we get it. Well done. Okay. So I tell that story now just because I raised the question of, well, what if everyone reads Nietzsche and we all get in our heads that, to hell with responsibilities, I'm going to pursue my excellence. Well, the functioning of society requires that there are a lot of mundane tasks that kind of need to be taken care of. If we're all just turning our backs on those things, everyone's trying to become some great musician or artist or I don't know what, a coder for video games or something like that. And a lot of people, most of us aren't gonna get very far. There's gonna be a lot of bad, right? All piling up amid underneath whatever good emerges from it. So it's not clear that this is kind of right way of approaching life that necessarily we want to see universalized, but maybe not. Maybe there's a way to scale it. Maybe, at what point does a person need to kind of be realistic and assessing themselves? I don't, it's a tricky idea. But certainly from Nietzsche's point of view, what Nietzsche very much was concerned about was the way that the traditional or any value system might, in a wholesale fashion, undercut, right, any pursuit of excellence. In many ways, we'd be better off shooting for the excellence and failing rather than never having the opportunity in the first place and losing out on what excellence may have been achieved. Nietzsche's philosophy is a philosophy of elitism. There's no, at times it can seem quite harsh. There's not much getting around that. Right? And it's not clearly, that's not, there's something to be said for elitism. Even those of us that aren't among the elite or in whatever the particular right practice or activity might be, we often benefit from what the elite in those areas or those practices can achieve. Right? I can't create the works of Shakespeare, but Shakespeare did, and I can read them and enjoy them and be inspired by them and maybe experience more out of life than I would have without their existence. So there's certainly something, right, to be said for this opportunity and for the kinds of values that Nietzsche suggests are the right ones to promote, at least a value system that allows for those of us that, right, will really flourish, that really will understand how to affirm life, will allow us to do just that sort of thing, right? So what we see is we see a transition in Nietzsche here from this kind of Schopenhauerian, yeah, life is bad, but enjoy art, kind of soothes the soul along the way, and it's that kind of thing, to a Nietzsche who now says that, look, the old values were life negating. Values that negate life, that say this life isn't worth anything, those values, right, that this life is just as at best a stepping stone to some next life or something like that, those values are problematic. Those are not life-affirming values. What we really need are life-affirming ones. And this is where notions like the will to power, the affirmation of life, truthfulness, honesty, art and artistry, individuality, autonomy, freedom of spirit, and pluralism. These are the kinds of values that Nietzsche is offering us in place of the values that have fallen away because God is dead. So Nietzsche does not leave us with nihilism. He's excited to motivate us and to take us beyond nihilism to a new set of values. All right. Okay. So with that overview kind of in mind, let's fill in a few more details. So, right, the revaluation of values is a key step in the development of Nietzsche's philosophy. The notion that to affirm life, right, that a person in a sense gets to create their own meaning in life, to decide what they want to pursue in life. This is liberating for Nietzsche. And the ultimate, in a sense, guide here or criterion for evaluation is excellence, is achieving excellence at things. Now, Nietzsche himself, all right, was especially a lover of art, of the arts, musical composition. He wrote a handful of competent musical compositions and such. He was befriended early in his life by the composer Richard Wagner, and they were fast friends for many years, definitely over a decade. But toward the end, Nietzsche kind of had a falling out with him. Nietzsche felt that Wagner later in his career, because Wagner was older than Nietzsche, that Wagner was becoming too populist, and and was also beginning to um, be influenced by sort of Christianity in ways that Nietzsche thought was problematic. So they eventually had a falling out later on. Um, but anyway, okay. So let me say something about the will to power, because this is an idea that has been misappropriated, right? So, and it's also an idea that doesn't fully get fleshed out because Nietzsche went insane before. He had notes for what looked like a book that maybe he was planning to publish called something like The Will to Power, but he never, he didn't make it. He didn't stay sane enough or long enough to get that into publishable form and get it published. Um, the notion of the will to power, again, it's open to abuse. It can almost be used to support something like a social Darwinism, right? The idea that it's all just a struggle, you pit your power against the power of others, and those that prove less powerful should just die off, and that's just how it should be. And it's not, that's Nietzsche was not a social Darwinist. But what Nietzsche did believe is that greatness, excellence, to truly manifest requires struggle, and often requires that we have opponents, but worthy opponents. Love your opponents. One of my professors, Bernard Regenster, who is a Nietzsche expert, I highly recommend his book on Nietzsche, The Affirmation of Life. Um, Bernard Regenster emphasizes this account of the will to power. In fact, one of I think it was the first published piece I ever had. It's in a book by Open Court Press. They have a series called Philosophy and Popular Culture, and my essay appears in a volume called The Red Sox and Philosophy. My essay is the only essay written by a Yankees fan. I'm touted on the back cover as we even have the Yankee fan perspective, right? So my essay, I'll see if I can find one of my last version of it. Maybe I'll make it available to the members. But the take on my essay basically is that I employ a Schopenhauerian and then a Nietzschean point of view, in which I point out that, think about it from the point of view of sports. If you have some first place medals at home or something like that, or you got a trophy, you came in first place kind of thing. And someone says, "Oh, wow, oh, look at that. You were in a basketball tournament and you came in first place." And you're like, "I sure did. I sure did, right? It was 12 and under, kids 12 and under." You're like, "Oh, that must have been like 10 years ago then." But wait, this says 2023. Oh, I was allowed in. So you were 25 playing against 12-year-old kids? Yeah, yeah. So of course you won. You're like twice their height. You're just dominating. That's ridiculous. You shouldn't be proud of that. That's lame, right? If you're beating a 3-year-old or 4-year-old at I don't know, tic-tac-toe, you shouldn't be crowing about it. A victory is sweet when it comes against opposition that's worthy, right? And worthy opposition can inspire you to greater heights. Nietzsche, right? To engage somebody who is not a worthy, that was a waste of time. Is silly. Let them alone. Leave them live their lives. But to have worthy challengers, even if it's just in the arts. Can I create better music than you, or can I create better literature than you? It doesn't have to be actually like jousting against each other. But whatever it could be creative endeavor. But to have those that you vie against, that kind of inspire you to be even greater than you thought you could be. That's what life calls for. All right. Now, the will to power is that drive to have challenges to overcome. Right? That there's this sense of being alive that one feels, life affirmation, right? When one comes up against challenges, struggles and even falls and has setbacks, but keeps pushing. I mean, Nietzsche himself was frail, was sickly, right? He was losing his eyesight, was confined to bed with migraines for weeks, if not months at a time. There's a sense in which a philosopher's philosophy is in many ways a reflection of their own biography, right? Um, You may be familiar with the quote of Nietzsche that goes something like, "That which doesn't kill you only makes you stronger," kind of thing, you know. It's kind of in that vein. It's that idea, right? That even the setbacks are opportunities to grow stronger, right? And that when we push against challenges and overcome them, oh, that's the stuff, right? That's the will to power being satisfied. But it's one thing to overcome one thing, but then you want to overcome the next. Now notice the contrast here with Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer, yeah, you got a desire and you satisfy it, and that's all well and good. But damn, then there's another desire, and this really sucks, and now you got to go through it again. For Nietzsche, the attitude's completely different. Yeah, damn right. There's another desire to come. It should be that way because you have a will to power, because you want the next thing to struggle against and to challenge you. That doesn't make life sad. That makes life awesome. That's what makes life awesome. Okay, so it's about the pursuit of self-fulfillment, struggling against frustration, not giving into it, but overcoming it, right? Love your opponents, choose worthy ones. Conflict can be good. An ethics of excellence. Okay, so Nietzsche's no nihilist, right? And we begin to see the values that he is now offering, right? This is something of a return to what he took to be the ancient Greek ethics of good and bad, excellence, not good and evil, right? It kind of what you might have referred to as a slave morality. Right. But again, it doesn't mean that those that aren't up to this or those that need help or are disabled are to be just thrown to the curb. Nietzsche never said that. There are plenty of us around who can take the time and help out. But but those who have that chance for excellence, don't hold them back by saying, no, sorry, you have to go tend to the sickly instead. It's not that the sickly shouldn't be tended to, but if tending to the sickly keeps excellence from being achieved, that's the problem. There's got to be a way for both. Or if there can't be, Nietzsche would still then plump for the excellence. Right. I forgot I think maybe it was Brian Leiter, who I mentioned recently in one of the posts. He's a Nietzsche expert. Highly recommend his book, Nietzsche on Morality. I think it was Leiter who wrote about the very notion of higher education and the idea that we have of, oh, we're trying to make higher education available to everybody, right, is from a Nietzschean point of view, that's an oxymoron. The whole point of higher education is to begin separating out the excellent from the ordinary, right? So this idea that higher education should just be there for everybody, and that somehow you got to kind of make it accessible to everybody, and which may very well then mean watering down the standards so that, individuals who before never would have gone into higher education, right, who are now there, if you keep maintaining the old standards, they're just going to fail out, and we can't have that. So what ends up happening is we have a race, right, toward the average. Now, in contemporary society, it's all a question, well, what is higher education dispensing these days? If it's dispensing a lot of job training, then okay, then fine. Then yeah, if someone can learn to do that job, then yeah, make that available for them. But if higher education isn't necessarily about job training, but it's about the pursuit of intellectual, right, attainments, well, then merit does begin. Then for those that either because of disposition, time, energy, effort, whatever it might be, right, don't have them in it to separate themselves from the pack, then that's okay. They still have a life to live. No one says you have to have a master's or a PhD or whatever. No, you don't need that for the good life. But for those that want to pursue such things, right, well, then let those opportunities be there. But there's a degree of struggle. Not everyone's going to make it. And from a Nietzschean point of view, it's very much how it should be, right? Competition is not always a bad thing. So we got the idea of will to power. Now, interestingly, there's two more notions here that are somewhat related. The notion of the eternal recurrence. Some of you may have heard of this before, right? So Nietzsche largely eschews metaphysics, but he shares this idea. He plays with this idea of the eternal recurrence. This idea that the universe repeats itself. Now, there's debate among scholars about whether Nietzsche was offering this or even considered this seriously as an actual cosmological, possibility, or whether it was just meant to be a kind of perspective to take that could be beneficial or salutary in certain ways or inspiring in certain ways. Okay, that's a little bit of an open question. There's definitely some sketchings in his notebooks where he does seem to cite some recent, at least at the time, sort of astronomical or cosmological findings that suggest the possibility of something like, a recurring universe or something like this. Okay. Whatever the case with that, the idea of the eternal recurrence is the idea that, right, our lives play themselves out, and that at some point it all repeats again, so that every single experience that you've had in your life, right, your life itself, right, and in the entire context in which it occurred, will someday circle back and repeat. The life you live will be the life that you will live again and again and again for all eternity. Now, here's the idea. Nietzsche asks us to consider this and then to think about how that makes you feel. That, if that very notion is disturbing, you're like, no, I don't want to have to go through that. I wouldn't want to go through this life again. Okay, right? Then Nietzsche, right, is going to say, well, then that's a failure. You need to live life in such a way that you can embrace every moment of it and affirm it and say, yes, yes, I affirm this. Live so as, with the warts and all, the mistakes and all, everything, but live so as to be able to look back on that life and say, I would do it exactly the same way again. There's a sense in which, this is almost like a way of, I think, visualizing what it would be like to affirm one's life all the way. There's no greater affirmation of life than to say, yeah, I'd live that one again exactly as it was. So, my take is Nietzsche probably at the end of the day recognized that this can do its job as a kind of thought experiment. It doesn't have to be cosmologically true. It can just as a thought experiment. Live your life so that you can say, yeah, I would live it exactly that way again and again and again. Right? Affirm. Because even now there's more philosophy that could be discussed here, but I don't want to go too much further. Right. Because of course Nietzsche wants to say that, look, even the apparent failures and setbacks still play a part in getting you to where you are now. So if the whole is something that you can embrace, right, there's this other idea in Nietzsche, amor fati, love of fate, right? To love one's fate. So there's a sense in which, this idea of the recurrence, you're fated to play this out again and again and again, is to love it, to be able to get yourself into a mindset, a kind of perspective where you're like, yes, and again, please, yes, to love one's fate, with warts and all. Okay, that is the epitome of what it would be to affirm life. Okay, so this is what Nietzsche's offering us. There's a sense in which it's life affirming. There's a lot that's inspiring about this picture. Now, there certainly are elements that are challenging, right? The elitism that's in it, the notion of a value system that alters perhaps the more familiar ethics or value system that society tends to work with. In practice, it's worth saying, in practice, there are plenty of times. Sometimes it's not for the best. In fact, often it's not for the best, because usually it's when really terrible things have happened. But we do say things like there's two justice systems, one for the famous or the wealthy, and then for the rest of us, kind of thing. And right, or you look at somebody like a star athlete who's busted on drugs or something like that, and our attitudes about drugs have changed, and the legal system regarding drugs has changed a little bit. But for example, and I remember in earlier years there was a baseball player for the New York Yankees, a pitcher named I just blanked out on his last name. Steve, what was his last name? Anyway, he got suspended 3 different times for cocaine abuse, right? But because he was a baseball player, He didn't really spend that much time in jail. They've always brought him back because he was a left-hander and he was an excellent pitcher. Steve Howe was his name, right? Okay, right. So, here's an athlete commits an infraction serious enough that for most of the rest of us, there have been some big problems. But because they're this star athlete, they're just so good. There's money to be made, right? That oftentimes, well, we got to, let's get him back out there, kind of thing, right? That sort of thing. Now I'm not putting that forward as kind of the example that Nietzsche necessarily has in mind or something like that, or one that we should really promote. But that idea that we make allowances perhaps for some individuals. We recognize artists sometimes as eccentric and so on. Okay, some of that idea is out there, but it is very much at the heart of the value system that Nietzsche thinks the overman would propose. Right. So a philosopher in the true sense for Nietzsche is somebody who offers up a value system, right? Especially one that is life affirming. A lot of Nietzsche's criticisms of his philosophical predecessors is that they were just promulgating more or less, the same value systems that were just there at the time that weren't particularly life affirming. A true philosopher for Nietzsche said breaks new ground. But it's not arbitrary. The ultimate criterion is the value system life affirming? Does it promote the pursuit of excellence? There is the question of perspectivalism or perspectivism. Does Nietzsche think that, just all truth is equal, something like that? I'll give you my take on it. There's still room for debate about this. And when I put together the bibliography, I'll indicate, authors who have defended a more radical perspectivalism or subjectivism, and then others such as Maud Marie Clark, who've argued for a more kind of objectivism. It is worth pointing out that for Nietzsche, the good is that which is, as I've now said several times, life affirming or life asserting. Nietzsche appears to recognize, while he recognizes truth and honesty as values, he does wrestle with the idea that sometimes the truth might not be life promoting. And if there are cases where the truth, let's say we figure out some truth about, I don't know, the natural world, physics, biology, whatever. And if that truth inevitably, unavoidably is life negating for some reason, then Nietzsche would say what's more important is life affirmation rather than negation. And so truth is good, but it's not the highest value for Nietzsche. And if a conflict arises between truth and goodness, which is anything that affirms life, then it's the affirmation of life that comes first. Okay, so it's not necessarily the case that Nietzsche thinks, oh, there aren't facts about how many chairs are in this room or something. He's not like this radical relativist, but he recognizes that not everything is about the kinds of facts that science is after, for example. There are other perspectives we can take on things when we're trying to decide what they mean to us and of what value they are to us. Okay. That's very cursory. There's a lot more that could be said about Nietzsche's play with perspectivism, but I'll leave that there for the time being. All right, I think that's the overview I wanted to offer. Comments, questions, thoughts? Maybe what I'll do is I'll stop the recording here, and that way if you guys have any comments or questions or thoughts, we can do it off the record, so to speak. Thank you for those of you that were here and those that watch this at some future date. I hope you got something out of it.